Are you passionate about shaping India's future? Keen to find solutions for India's most pressing challenges? Look no further than Takstashila's postgraduate program in public policy. This 48-weekend program will equip you with the knowledge, skills, and network needed to pivot to a meaningful career in public policy. Apply in the link below by June 1st. The program begins June 20th. Hope to see you there.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Over the last decade, the global conversation on power has expanded from oil to include energy security, supply chain security, and now to the minerals that power technology. Countries are racing to secure lithium, cobalt, and rare earths, the building blocks of everything from batteries to semiconductors and AI systems. Alliances like Pax Silica are emerging, and critical minerals are fast becoming the foundation of geopolitical power. But where does India stand in this new world? I'm Shreya, and I'm really excited to be speaking with Shobhankita Reddy, research analyst at the Takshashila Institution, on this topic. Hi, Shobs. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Shreya. Thanks for having me.
So, Shobs, you've been writing about this recently, right? I had a chance to read some of it, and you talk about how in India there are vast reserves, but the country struggles to mine, process, and scale. And correct me if I'm wrong, but in terms of numbers, it looks like India contributes well under 1% of global rare earth production, with less than 20% of its geological potential having been explored. Just to get us started, right, what are some of the barriers in India's rare earth and critical mineral ecosystem today?
Yeah, thanks so much, Shreya. I think, what you started with in terms of reserves is an important start in the sense that India does have vast geological potential, but much of it has not even been explored. And some of that has to do just with investments in the sense that private investments have been far and few in between, and also the fact that mining is extremely polluting, which means that any project that has started has either faced technical deficiencies or bureaucratic red tape or just environmental protests and delays on that front. So the International Energy Agency says that time between discovery to first production in most mining projects on an average globally is 16 years. So it's not like this is quick, right? So the process of prospecting, reconnaissance, being able to then explore and get projects given away in terms of production licenses, this entire pipeline of exploration to production from discovery to first production is in itself quite time consuming.
Right.
But India in general does far worse than that in the sense that our timelines are much longer because we have had, cases of regulatory challenges, slow private sector investment, technical deficiencies, and several projects that have stalled after a lot of investment and time that was put into them. And maybe if I were to storytell a little bit and go back in time, much of this started in the past decade. So actually, with the economic reforms in 1991, we had this expansion of the sector to the private sector and inviting in FDI into the sector. So the National Mineral Policy in 1993, and then some amendments to the Mines and Minerals Development and Regulation Act in 1957. The amendment took place of that in 1994, the first significant one. All of them sought to expand the role of the private sector and bring in FDI into the sector. And I think much of the challenge was also to do with the fact that at the time, and even today, the global policy to allocate any of these reserves is actually first come, first serve. And it might sound counterintuitive, and this also became the subject of the massive Colgate scandal and so on, around 2012.
Right.
But actually, in this sector, because one doesn't really know the quality of the ore, the quantity of the ore, the specific price and profit margins possible at the time of exploration. Exploration is then incentivized by the ability to mine and also allocated in a first come, first serve basis. Because if it has to be auctioned, then what typically happens is auctions necessitate an upfront capital risk, and private businesses don't even know if that upfront capital risk will then be paid off for them, because the quality of just the geological reserves is not yet clearly established. So the global practice on this is first come, first serve, which is what also India adopted, when it sought to expand the role of the private sector in the 90s. But I think much of that changed in 2012. So, but in the time being, actually, the time period between 1998 and say about 2008, that particular decade is when we had a lot of private sector boom, a lot of FDI boom, and we had a lot of renewed interest, as it were, in exploration, right? And a lot of reserves at the time were, at least to some extent, discovered. And some of this were brownfield, in the sense that we already knew these were explored and established, but the production in some sense grew. And some were even greenfield. And a particular example of this is greenfield exploration of a diamond deposit in Madhya Pradesh. And this was done by Rio Tinto, which is a British-Australian multinational company. And we see that 1998 to 2008, a lot of activity happens. And then I think much of this got held up in the political economy of the corruption scandals of the 2010s. So, Shekhar Gupta of The Print today, he has written about this extensively. And he actually says much of this unfolded under several reports of the CAG of India at the time. And, he also sarcastically calls the man the holy national accountant, the capital H, capital N, capital A, sarcastically, because it was as if the CAG of India at the time had taken it upon himself to investigate cases where there was a loss to the exchequer. And one of the things that, came out at the time was, of course, the Colgate scandal, which is this notional loss of about 1.86 lakh crore to the exchequer that, was calculated. And remember, this is all notional in the sense that there was no real money lost, but it was all calculated that if the process of allocation had been more transparent, more fair, maybe auctions, not first come, first serve, then the exchequer would have gained this much. And remember, in public policy, we always say it's not really revenue maximization that helps with the common good, right? I mean, sometimes the role of public policy is not necessarily even...
Shobh, sorry to cut you short, but I wanted to quickly ask you if you could speak a little bit about the scandal itself for listeners who might not be aware of what's transpired, or even just broadly.
Yeah, okay. So in terms of the coal allocation scandal, right? So actually, prior to this was the 2G spectrum license allocation scandal. And also we had the Commonwealth Games scandal. So it seemed like the season of scandals in some sense, where the CAG kept tabling reports, sometimes directly to the media and not necessarily even in parliament. And so there were always some leaks where some of this got a lot of national headlines. But specifically with the license allocations, right? So the auction method that was decided and was policy was actually first come, first serve. And I think I've explained why that was global policy and continues to be common global policy at this point in time, because auctions would necessitate an upfront capital risk. And in some sense, doing it at a first come, first serve basis just removes all of that hassle and allows for more people to come explore and potentially develop a site that currently is not even explored or developed, and potentially get it closer to production timelines.
Right.
So this particular scandal was about, again, was it fair that allocations were made in this way versus another? And, there was a lot of allegations put on, the coal minister at the time. So it seemed like there were a lot of numbers flying around, sometimes 8 lakh crores, 10 lakh crores, sometimes they were tempered down to 1.86 lakh crores. So it was definitely an interesting time where numbers were being thrown around in terms of notional losses to the exchequer. And this was to do with what the CAG report said was the government's failure to employ competitive bidding, in the sense that we had not followed an auction process, in the sense that this was political in some sense, and it got a lot of public attention. We also know that, parallel to this was the Anna Hazare movement that was essentially about anti-corruption, although it was political. It was the season of scandals. Yes, exactly. So I think much of this brought a lot of people's angst into the timelines, and also brought some of this policy, and it's interesting, right? Because the scam cannot be that a certain policy was followed, because the government chooses its policy. But then to ascertain that this policy was not fairly followed, I guess, makes sense. But to then also say it should have been auctions and not first come, first serve, I think was missing some nuance. Right. And this went to the Supreme Court. And I think the Supreme Court's wording and the language was also quite interesting. And it kind of shaped how the sector moved forward. So, for example, the Supreme Court said that auctions were a preferable method as long as the objective was revenue maximization. And then it also countered itself by saying, but revenue maximization need not necessarily be the only goal. Maybe, the common good, as it were, social welfare goals, etc., are actually, the policy requirement in terms of which allocation method is followed. And then it said, if revenue maximization helps achieve the common good, then auctions may be a preferable method. And then it finally stepped back from all of this and said, whatever policy is chosen, it needs to be fair, transparent, and in pursuit of healthy competition. So it was interestingly worded in the sense that it was opining on the policy in itself, in the sense that it should be fair, transparent, and supportive of healthy competition. But at the same time, with this, mixed up thing about revenue maximization and the common good, it seemed like it was pushing for an auction method. And, while the judgment said all of this, the court was quite clear in its actions, and 204 out of 218 coal blocks that were allocated all the way back to 1993, because remember, at the point of time that this judgment was even happening, and the CAG report and the court hearing was happening, it was 2012. So it went back at least a decade, and 204 out of 218 coal blocks allocated since 1993 were deemed to have failed this test and cancelled. So there was also this threat that any allocation made in a way that the court deems is not fair could then be revoked, and also retrospectively almost, right?
Yeah.
So I think this kind of set the precedent for what was to happen. So the 2015 amendment, so again, the government of the day changed, the Modi government came to power, and in 2015, their amendment to the MMDR actually replaced the first come, first serve method to the auction system. And I think this was, in some sense, a very, very significant change. Much of it was, political in some sense. From the corruption scandals and the Supreme Court hearing, etc. And this had a lot of impact on what was to happen in the sector following that. So about 66,000 applications that were pending with different state governments in terms of applications or approvals for licenses, etc., they all got automatically cancelled because these applications were filed, when it was first come, first serve, and now we had suddenly moved into the auction system. So that changed. And then the 2015 amendment also added a few things retrospectively. So a National Mineral Exploration Trust was set up, and a contribution from the revenues of mining companies or the licenses that these companies would pay to governments was added. A district mineral fund was set up, and the levy of this fund was introduced so that, you get a pool of funding to do exploration projects. So in some sense, some of these actions in terms of changing to auction system that would require a lot more upfront risk by the private capital, and setting up these extra funds where the government of India then takes upon some of the early exploration activity upon itself, actually shifted some of the burden and incentives from the private sector to the state.
Right.
And the funny thing is, anything that was pre-2015 allocated, because they were deemed to be non-competitive in how those licenses were allocated, the DMF, the District Mineral Fund, allocated for that was 30% royalty, as opposed to for newer licenses, it would be 10% royalty.
Right.
So again, you see this judgment call where one policy of the government is considered to be non-competitive and hence, in some sense, not too stringent on the private sector as another. So you see a little bit of state control and incentives being shifted from the private sector to the state. And I think the original line that you quoted initially, right, which is about less than 20% of India's geological resources have been explored, that's got to do a lot with the fact that the Geological Survey of India, the government of India, they have capacity challenges and tech challenges. And by shifting from first come, first serve to auctions, we have essentially actually bolstered some of these things. And we have shifted those incentives for the worse. And actually, you know what? The data and the evidence on this is quite clear. So if you look at auction data from 2015 to 2021, since this amendment came over, you see that actually this policy change has had detrimental effects, and that auctions, in fact, are prone to manipulation too. So to assume that auctions are fair versus first come, first serve is actually not true, because what's happened is several auction blocks that were already operational, just by mere procedural changes because of the amendment, the data looks like as if, there's been more auction activity. And the second thing is, if you look at just the value of some of these auctions versus the actual mineral reserve, even at a very high level estimation, many of the auctioned bids are much higher than the estimated value of the mineral reserves, which means that there is a certain concentration in the private sector or the mining companies that are even applying for these licenses. So the kind of companies that would apply for these licenses would be those companies that also have downstream industry connections or downstream processing or downstream industry manufacturing, capacities. And so they're able to subsidize the costs of their mining with their downstream. So, we see some of these weirdities in some sense. And in all of this, in the decade since 2008 or so, we see the unraveling also of the fact that at the end of the day, our ease of doing business is poor and our regulatory red tape is in some sense poor, right? So, for example, the Rio Tinto company, which is this British Australian multinational company that had led the successful milestone greenfield exploration of the diamond deposits in Madhya Pradesh, actually abandoned the mine in 2017. And it's quite interesting where they say they're handing it over, as if, and I'm sure it was quite bitter for them because it was embroiled in environmental protests, it was embroiled in clearances not coming through, right? So, for example, after investing $90 million at the time and almost 14 years in India, they completely abandoned the project, gave it back to the Madhya Pradesh government, which then auctioned the block to an Aditya Birla Group subsidiary in 2019. And even as of today, that awaits approvals to start operations. So you see how, just regulatory challenges, difficulty for some of these companies to navigate business in India means that, in some sense, overall, from what we used to be in the decade between 1998 to 2008 and in the decade since, from 2008 to around 2018 or so, we have actually regressed in policy. So I think that's this complicated story, and we have written about this, and we have used actually quite some harsh language on this. We say India has a mine-sized cap in its mineral strategy, and many of the changes made since the Colgate scandal, in some sense, continue to have effects on the industry today. So I think that's the context. And of course, none of this has to do particularly with critical minerals, which is honestly our conversation for the day, but it's got a lot to do with the same mining sector, right? I mean, the fact that critical minerals today are so important, and much of this has to do with geopolitical tension, supply chain resilience in the last 2 years or so. But the fact that this is the state of our mining industry broadly, prior to the National Critical Mineral Mission coming over in the last 2-3 years, means that slow change is inevitable. And in any sense, whatever the Indian government does today, particularly vis-a-vis the private sector, etc., it is this historical baggage and the trust deficit in some sense that it needs to get past to be able to now attract foreign capital and investments, etc. And some of this, is continuing because there was a previous judgment in 1989 which deemed that royalty was tax. So the fact that royalty on mining is tax and meant that state governments could not have a separate royalty to tax. But in 2024, the Supreme Court actually held the reverse. So it upturned the previous judgment, and it said that royalty on mining is actually not a tax, and hence states can levy additional taxes on mining activities. So what this means is now the Supreme Court has gone back and said, all the way back from 1992, state governments now have a right to have retrospective royalties paid to them in the next whatever, right? So the judgment is for a long period of time. I mean, for the next 12 years or so, payments are to be expected, retrospective payments are expected. So you see how there is a certain sense of an extractive state here, the certain sense that these mining companies come, extract, take away your resources, and don't necessarily give back. And so they must be willing to pay higher, charges, higher contributions, sort of give back to the communities and the vulnerable communities of the districts where they mine. And there is, I mean, all of that is fair, but the nature in which this has been imposed, retrospectively canceling all the coal allocations, back to 1993, overturning a previous judgment and going back in time and asking now for royalties from decades ago, I think that's the trust deficit that India continues to face in the mining sector. As much as we are at a time where we require, the critical mineral mining, processing collaborations to take off,
Right.
the base industry, as it were, of all of this continues to have all of these challenges.
Yeah, like you said, right? I mean, considerations for environment, endangered communities, forests, all of that is extremely important as well. But from what you've been telling us, it sounds like a very cautious, extractive set of policy interventions over multiple years. It doesn't bode very well for attracting private investment. And of course, the upstream results of this are also quite drastic, right?
Correct. Yes, yes. And I want to bring your attention to the recent policy, right? Because I think when we talk about critical minerals, at least in the government's notice, these might have come to the fore first around 2010 when China had an embargo or a pseudo embargo, because Beijing hasn't really officially, taken responsibility for what it did in 2010. Even today, Beijing says it was the act of certain port officials where shipments of rare earths to Japan were blocked. While globally, in some sense, New York Times, etc., reported that as a state-led embargo on Japan. Beijing, even today, doesn't acknowledge that that's what it did in 2010. So I would say 2010 was perhaps the time when critical minerals and rare earths particularly came into the notice of most governments globally, and I would assume even India's, although I couldn't be sure. I think that's when it became supremely important. And in terms of policy making, in terms of listing down what our critical minerals are in terms of India's needs, I think much of that came in the 2023 amendment to the MMDR that laid emphasis on critical minerals. And policies have since rapidly tried to improve and streamline processes. So first step that happened was 6 minerals that were in the list of atomic minerals. And this is important because critical minerals, rare earths particularly, many of them occur in the Earth's crust alongside other atomic minerals, which may have, some radioactive component, etc. And so they may be considered a little more important in terms of national security, or they might even be fissile material, etc. Right? So this material gets a lot more attention. So 6 particular minerals were removed from the list of atomic minerals in 2023, allowing private sector participation in the sector. Also, the cap on sale of minerals in the open market by captive mines was removed. And then, certain policy changes have happened in terms of introducing a separate exploration license regime, which meant that you will have a separate license, particularly just to do prospecting and reconnaissance, may not necessarily need to translate to a right to mine, but, with a separate EL, you can attract, for example, junior explorers with particular technological expertise just to do the exporting. The exploring. So you have such new changes brought about recently. And exploration activity, for example, now there is a 50% cost reimbursement capped at about 20 crores, split across 6 stages of the exploration process that the government foots. But again, much of this in our policy recommendations and what we have written, we have said that it's too little and too far in between. For example, because exploration is such a leverage point for policy intervention, getting blocks quickly from the exploration stage forward, and even exploration is actually G1, G2, G3, G4. There are stages in there in terms of, how much surety we have about the ore, the quality, the quantity, etc. So different levels in which you can do this.
I imagine.
Yeah, correct. So one way that we could proceed is by treating an exploration project exactly like how the government today treats a semiconductor fab construction project with almost 50% or so of upfront capital, and maybe it doesn't have to be 50%, but some kind of upfront capital where the government funds at an equal footing, not as a post facto reimbursement with a cap of 20 crores, which is too little in terms of the vast timelines and hundreds of crores that exploration projects can actually be. So I think maybe that kind of changes in the exploration license regime going forward, particularly with critical minerals, may be helpful. On top of, for example, many of the royalties for critical minerals today are now reduced. But otherwise, for traditional bulk materials, there has been some calculation that almost effective tax, combining all the royalties and all the district mineral fund contributions and so on and so forth, all of that put together, the effective tax rate for many of these companies for bulk minerals, of course, for critical minerals, now the prices have been rationalized. The royalties are so high, 10 to 15%, that the effective tax rate is 60 to 65%. So again, that's quite hard on companies, especially if you want to further call for investments in the sector, right? So expand. Of course, critical minerals have this halo around them at this point in time, but I think rationalizing and reforming the sector, as it were, would change many of the fundamentals.
You had also written about high-grade monazite, right? Could you speak a little about that?
Yes.
The mining process?
Yes, correct. So the fact that much of India's rare earth minerals are light rare earths, and they are present in India's beach sands. And of course, India has a vast coast, and these beach sands have what is called monazite. And monazite contains thorium and rare earths. And because thorium is, again, this atomic mineral listed in the Atomic Energy Act and also in the Shanti Act, which is now the rebranded version, right? I mean, in December, the previous Atomic Energy Act was scrapped, and now we have the Shanti Act. So all of this means that because monazite contains thorium, we restrict monazite mining, beach sand mining to the state. So essentially, beach sand mining today happens only by IREL and to some very limited extent by a PSU in Kerala. And IREL is also exploring, for example, partnerships to do processing of some of this material with, say, Japanese or South Korean firms. But the fact that beach sand mining should actually or could potentially open up an avenue for rare earth mining, rare earth access, if it were to be open to the private sector, is a case that we have made. I mean, it's not that the government had not tried this. The government has had this open for a while in the 2010s. And again, beach sand mining is super easy, right? I mean, all you have to do is dredge the floor closer to the coast. And you have material from which you get a whole bunch of minerals, one of which happens to be monazite. And all the other minerals that you get, you can use, for example, in construction, in industry, etc., etc. So they all have commercial applications. And monazite, of course, has thorium and rare earths, which have varied applications. But because of monazite and because of the fact that these are really fragile ecosystems, the beach sands, there's fishing communities, these are all very fragile in terms of just the ecology there, and we want to protect that as well. And because of rampant corruption in the sector, they've completely closed doors to the private sector and now taken all of this into the hands of IREL and that one PSU in Kerala. So we have written about how in some phased way, we should consider opening this up because India still has all of those light rare earths and we're not exploiting them sufficiently. And this does not mean that we have to sacrifice all of India's coast. We can have select sectors, select phased approaches where maybe, some parts of Orissa, some parts of Tamil Nadu, etc., where maybe there is more political will or capability to mine, even create some of these rare earth corridors, as it were, where you have that capability to process at a slightly larger scale even than what we are doing right now. Because right now, it's only in the hands of a few PSUs. The capacity is small. What's happening is very small scale. And it's not even enough for India's own consumption, right? So if in some sense we can develop capability here, and again, because beach sand is so easy in terms of dredging the floor. All you have to do is dredge the beach. And it is fairly a concentrated ore as well, because waves and mechanical action and the wind over time have put all of these quartz material closer to the coast, in the sense that what you get is quite concentrated, and the process of separating that is fairly simple, in the sense that it's mechanical and magnetic, not so much chemical. So the process is quite straightforward as well. So, if we can open that to the private sector in whatever shape and form, right? Maybe IREL subcontracts some of the mining to the private sector. Maybe there is some scope for more monitoring and ensuring that all of the monazite is handed over to the IREL in a way that makes a little more sense than it was being enforced in the 2010s when all of this had to shut shop. Essentially, the point is a complete ban doesn't make sense.
Right.
It's not in India's national interest. It's not in India's commercial interest. It's not even helping just build base capability in a sector that's increasingly being geopolitically contested. Of course, these light rare earths will not help us with, having magnet production in India completely in-house. I mean, you'll still need to partner with, say, European Battery Initiative and so on and so forth. You would still need to do a lot more, because light rare earths are still not heavier rare earths. And it's the heavy rare earths in some sense that are highly useful for permanent magnets. Light rare earths have different applications, but it's India's own base capability, and it helps us have our own and negotiate for more at international forums that India is currently negotiating at. So all the mineral diplomacy outreaches that India is doing, with some base capability in-house, with being able to do, for example, not just mining inside, but also ramping up recycling, and also doing maybe cross-border collaborations for processing.
I see.
Having some tech transfers maybe from Europe, because they would like to do more magnet production, etc. And they would want to expand. And India offers manufacturing scale and talent, and at least comparatively, a better environment to do some of these things in terms of environmental standards, etc. We can leverage some of our strengths to then negotiate for more. So this is a case for India to do more on all fronts, in terms of mining, in terms of processing, in terms of diplomatic outreach, in terms of having collaborations for recycling plants, magnet production facilities, etc., with international and like-minded friends globally. But it's also the case for, we have these resources and we refuse to, make use of them, because we are in some sense, hung up in our little domestic challenges, which if we can reform in some sense, it would help.
Yeah, you also started in one of your articles writing about how India joined the G7 discussions on critical minerals, right? And of course, now you bring up the gamut of just options for collaboration. Do you see any of this changing in the next few years, like any sort of policy changes afoot?
I think there's a lot of appetite for international partnerships. In some sense, every day following this sector seems to me like India has been signing MOUs left, right, and center with resource-rich countries, with EU, with the US, with multilateral institutions that are perhaps even US-led, like the Pax Silica, Forge, which was previously the Mineral Security Partnership. So it almost seems like there's a new MOU being signed every day. Recently there's been talks.
Shobs, I think this is a great place to also end this podcast. You've done a fantastic explainer, I think, in just giving our listeners a background of the institutions that manage our mines, unexplored mines as well, the incentives at play, some of the historic challenges that have perhaps brought a bit more caution into the winds for this sector, and also some idea of what's in store for us in the future. I think this is a space that we'll come back to in a future podcast, perhaps. I'm also aware that you have a fun course coming up next month, if you'd like to say a couple of lines about that.
Yeah, actually, it's been quite a packed few weeks for me. At one end, it almost seems like all my friends are getting married. And at another, I have this course that I'm putting together. So this is what we call the politics and policy of critical minerals. And this is meant to be a fun, engaging, relatable, and a multidisciplinary take on critical minerals, because critical minerals is so cross-cutting, right? I mean, so many industries are affected by critical mineral supply chains, folks interested in energy transition, climate tech, deep tech. Also, from a technology perspective, economics perspective, geopolitics perspective, it almost seems like so many things come together for the global scramble for critical minerals in some sense that is playing out. So this course is meant to unpack some of that complexity, make it digestible, provide knowledge, analytical frameworks meant to understand the complexities. And so a lot of my time currently is going in putting together this and making this happen. The course starts May 9th and currently applications are open. So hopefully this is already proved to be great learning experience for me, and hopefully I come out learning even more.
Awesome. How exciting for all of our listeners who are already pretty excited about this sector and this ecosystem. We'll share the link in the show notes as well. We'll also share everything Shobs has written on this topic recently, just for you to connect the dots with what you've listened and, what's already covered in these outputs. But that's a wrap, Shobs. Please have a great course. I hope you have some amazing conversations with faculty and interested participants who end up joining, and to some great weddings as well.
Thanks, Shreya.
Thanks again, Shobs. Bye, folks. We'll see you next time.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.